I was drinking my morning coffee on the back patio when I noticed something odd hanging from the oak tree in my yard. A bright blue birdhouse, the kind you see at craft fairs, was dangling from one of the lower branches. I definitely had not put it there. My name is Chen, and I had lived in the Ridgewood Estates subdivision in Plano, Texas, for about 3 years. The neighborhood was nice enough, with well-maintained lawns and friendly neighbors, but the homeowners association had a reputation for being overzealous. I had mostly avoided their scrutiny by keeping my grass trimmed and my house painted an acceptable shade of beige. But this birdhouse situation was about to introduce me to a whole new level of HOA insanity. I walked across the dewy grass to get a closer look. The birdhouse was secured with wire wrapped tightly around a branch about 8 feet off the ground. It was not just placed there casually. Someone had deliberately installed it on my tree without asking permission. I stood there for a moment, confused about who would do such a thing and why they would think it was acceptable to attach something to a tree on my property. The oak tree was one of the main reasons I had bought this house. It was massive, probably 70 years old, with thick branches that provided perfect shade over my back patio during the brutal Texas summers. The tree sat firmly in the center of my backyard, about 20 feet from my property line on all sides. There was no question that it was entirely on my land. I grabbed my ladder from the garage and carried it over to the tree. It took me a few minutes to unwrap the wire, being careful not to damage the bark. The birdhouse was heavier than it looked, made from some kind of dense wood and painted with multiple coats of that aggressive blue color. I climbed down with it and examined the bottom. There was a small plaque screwed into the base that read Ridgewood Estates Community Beautification Project 2026. That explained who was responsible, though not why they thought they could just install things on my property without asking. I carried the birdhouse into my garage and set it on a workbench, then went back to enjoying my Saturday morning. I figured someone from the HOA would eventually realize it was missing and contact me, at which point I would politely explain that they needed to ask permission before installing things on other people's property. Monday morning came and went without incident. I worked from home as a software developer, so I spent most of the day in my home office, barely thinking about the birdhouse situation. It was not until Tuesday afternoon that I heard the doorbell ring. I opened the door to find a woman in her late 40s standing on my porch, her arms crossed, and her face already twisted into an expression of indignation. She had that particular haircut, the one that seemed to be standard issue for a certain type of suburban authority figure. Short, heavily highlighted, and styled in a way that somehow conveyed both professionalism and aggression. "Are you Marcus Chen?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Yes, can I help you?" "I am Sharon Whitmore, president of the Ridgewood Estates Homeowners Association. I am here about the missing community birdhouse." I had suspected this was coming, but I was still somewhat surprised by her confrontational approach. "Oh, you mean the one that was attached to my tree without permission?" Sharon's eyes narrowed. "That birdhouse was installed as part of our community beautification initiative. We have been placing them throughout the neighborhood to encourage local wildlife and improve the aesthetic appeal of Ridgewood Estates." "That's great," I said, trying to keep my tone friendly. "But you installed it on my tree on my property without asking me first." "You cannot just attach things to other people's trees. The tree is visible from the community walking path," Sharon said, as if this explained everything. "It therefore falls under the HOA's purview for community beautification projects." I blinked at her, genuinely confused by this logic. "My tree is 20 feet inside my property line. The fact that people can see it from the walking path does not give you the right to attach things to it. According to Section 7 of the HOA bylaws, the association has the authority to maintain community aesthetics throughout the neighborhood," Sharon said, pulling a folder from under her arm. She flipped through several pages, and pointed to a paragraph of dense legal text. This includes the implementation of beautification projects that enhance the overall visual appeal of Ridgewood Estates. I scanned the paragraph she indicated. It was vague language about maintaining property standards and community appearance, the kind of thing that could probably be interpreted a dozen different ways. This does not say you can install things on private property without permission, I said. The birdhouse weighs less than 5 pounds and causes no damage to the tree, Sharon said. It is a minor aesthetic enhancement that benefits the entire community. I need you to reinstall it immediately. No, I said simply. If you want to put birdhouses in common areas or on your own property, that's fine. But my tree is my property, and I get to decide what goes on it. Sharon's face flushed red. This is exactly the kind of selfish attitude that undermines community cohesion. We are trying to create a beautiful, welcoming neighborhood, and you are refusing to cooperate over something as simple as a birdhouse. It is not about the birdhouse itself, I said, feeling my own patience starting to wear thin. It is about the principle. You cannot just put things on my property without asking. I am asking now, Sharon said. Please reinstall the birdhouse. And I am saying no. If you had asked before installing it, we could have had a conversation about it. But you did not ask, and now I am not comfortable with having it on my tree. Sharon closed her folder with a sharp snap. This is not over, Mr. Chen. The HOA takes community standards very seriously. You will be hearing from us. She turned and walked back to her car, a white SUV with a custom license plate that read HOPRES. I watched her drive away, already knowing this was going to become a bigger issue than it should have been. Over the next week, I received 3 letters from the HOA. The first was a formal notice requesting that I reinstall the birdhouse within 5 business days. The second was a warning that failure to comply would result in a fine of $50 per day. The third was a letter informing me that I was in violation of the community beautification standards and would be required to attend a special HOA board meeting to address my ongoing non-compliance. I ignored all 3 letters. I was not going to reinstall something that had been placed on my property without permission, and I certainly was not going to pay fines for refusing to do so. I considered reaching out to some of my neighbors to see if anyone else had experienced similar issues with the HOA, but I had always kept mostly to myself and did not know many people in the neighborhood well enough to have those kinds of conversations. The special board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community center. I debated whether to attend or simply ignore it, but I decided it would be better to make my case in person. Maybe if I explained my position to the entire board, they would see reason and drop the issue. The community center was a single-story building near the neighborhood entrance, with a small parking lot and a playground behind it. When I arrived at 7 o'clock, there were already a dozen cars in the lot. I walked inside to find a meeting room set up with chairs arranged in rows facing a long table at the front. Sharon sat in the center of the table, flanked by 4 other board members. About 20 residents were scattered among the audience chairs. I took a seat in the 3rd row and waited for the meeting to start. Sharon called the meeting to order at 7 sharp and worked through several routine items on the agenda. There was discussion about pool maintenance, approval of the previous meeting's minutes, and a debate about whether to repave the walking paths. Finally, 45 minutes in, Sharon cleared her throat and looked directly at me. "We now move to new business," she said. Specifically, the matter of Mr. Marcus Chen's refusal to comply with the Community Beautification Initiative. All eyes in the room turned to look at me. I felt my face grow warm but kept my expression neutral. "Mr. Chen," Sharon continued, "you have been sent multiple notices regarding the birdhouse that was installed on the oak tree in your backyard. Despite repeated requests, you have refused to reinstall this community enhancement. Would you like to explain your reasoning to the board?" I stood up, figuring it would be easier to address the room if I was on my feet. The birdhouse was installed on my property without my permission. The tree is entirely within my property boundaries, and I have the right to decide what is attached to it. I am not opposed to birdhouses in general, but I am opposed to the HOA installing things on my private property without asking first. One of the other board members, a man in his 60s wearing a golf shirt, spoke up. The beautification initiative was approved by the board to enhance the neighborhood's appeal. We have installed 15 birdhouses throughout Ridgewood Estates as part of this project. Were all of them installed on private property without permission? I asked. The board members exchanged glances. Sharon answered. Several were placed in locations that technically fall within individual property lines, yes. However, all of these locations are visible from common areas and contribute to the overall aesthetic of the neighborhood. That does not give you the right to install them without permission, I said. Being visible from a common area does not make private property somehow public. A woman in the audience raised her hand. Sharon acknowledged her and she stood up. I am Jennifer Mills. I live on Oakwood Drive. The HOA installed one of these birdhouses on a tree in my front yard. I did not mind because I think it looks nice, but I do remember thinking it was odd that no one asked me first. Another hand went up, this time from a man near the back. Dave Patterson, Maple Lane, same situation here. They put one on my fence post. I mean, I do not really care, but yeah, nobody asked. I felt a small surge of validation, at least I was not being unreasonable. Look, I said, addressing the board, I am not trying to be difficult, but there is a proper way to do things. If you want to put a birdhouse on my tree, you need to ask permission first. You cannot just install it and then demand that I keep it there. Sharon's jaw tightened. The HOA bylaws give the board authority to maintain community standards. This includes aesthetic improvements that benefit all residents. Your refusal to cooperate is selfish and undermines the community spirit we are trying to foster. My refusal to let you put things on my property without permission is not selfish, I said, feeling my frustration building. It is a basic property right. Property rights are not absolute when you live in an HOA community, Sharon shot back. You agreed to abide by our rules when you purchased your home. I agreed to follow reasonable rules, I said. I did not agree to let you treat my property as if it belongs to the HOA. The meeting devolved from there. Several residents spoke up in support of the beautification project, praising the birdhouses and saying they made the neighborhood more charming. A few others seemed sympathetic to my position, but did not want to openly contradict the board. Sharon repeatedly cited various sections of the HOA bylaws, all of which used vague language about community standards and aesthetic maintenance. After nearly an hour of circular arguments, Sharon called for a vote. The board voted unanimously to uphold the fine of $50 per day until I reinstalled the birdhouse. They also added an additional fine of $250 for willful non-compliance with board directives. I left the meeting angry and frustrated. When I got home, I drafted an email to the board explaining as clearly as I could that I would not be reinstalling the birdhouse and would not be paying any fines. I cited Texas property law and included several links to legal resources about property rights. I sent the email at 11:30 that night and went to bed feeling like I had at least made my position clear. The next morning, I received a response from Sharon. It was brief and cold. Your continued non-compliance is noted. The fines will continue to accumulate. The HOA is prepared to take legal action if necessary to enforce community standards. I had hoped it would not come to that, but I was not going to back down. The principle mattered. If I let the HOA get away with this, what would they try next? Install security cameras on my house. Plant flowers in my garden. There had to be a line, and I was drawing it at them, attaching things to my property without permission. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from a law firm. The HOA was suing me for breach of the community covenants and seeking to recover the accumulated fines, which now totaled over $1,000. They were also requesting a court order compelling me to reinstall the birdhouse and comply with future beautification initiatives. I stared at the legal documents spread across my kitchen table, genuinely stunned that it had escalated this far. Over a birdhouse. A decorative birdhouse that probably cost $30 at most. But here I was, being sued by my own HOA for refusing to let them attach it to my tree. I knew I needed a lawyer. I spent the weekend researching attorneys who specialized in property disputes and HOA issues. On Monday morning, I called a firm in Dallas that had good reviews and experience with homeowner association cases. I spoke with an attorney named David Ramirez who listened to my story and then laughed. "I am sorry," he said. "I should not laugh, but this is one of the more absurd HOA cases I have heard in a while." "So you think I have a case?" I asked. "Oh, absolutely. Texas property law is very clear about this. A tree that is entirely within your property boundaries is your property. The HOA cannot install anything on it without your permission, regardless of what their bylaws say. HOA rules cannot override state property law." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. That is what I thought, but the HOA president keeps insisting their bylaws give them the authority. HOA presidents often think they have more power than they actually do, David said. The bylaws can cover a lot of things, like what color you can paint your house or how tall your grass can be. But they cannot give the HOA the right to use your property without permission. That is basic trespass and property law. "So what do?" I asked. "We file a response to their lawsuit, and then we countersue for harassment and legal fees. We will probably also want to send a cease and desist letter regarding the fines they have been threatening. This case is not going to make it very far in court." David's retainer was expensive, but I figured it was worth it. I was not just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every homeowner who had ever been bullied by an overreaching HOA. Over the next 2 months, the legal proceedings moved forward. David filed our response and countersuit, arguing that the HOA had trespassed on my property by installing the birdhouse without permission, and had then compounded the violation by demanding I keep it installed and threatening fines. We included photos of my property survey showing that the tree was clearly within my boundaries, as well as documentation of all the threatening letters the HOA had sent. The HOA's attorney, a woman named Patricia Ventura, filed a response that leaned heavily on the HOA bylaws and the concept of community benefit. She argued that homeowners in an HOA community give up certain property rights in exchange for the benefits of living in a well-maintained neighborhood. She cited several cases where HOAs had been upheld in enforcing aesthetic standards. David was not impressed. Those cases all involve things like requiring homeowners to maintain their own property according to certain standards, he explained to me over the phone. This is completely different. The HOA is not asking you to do something with your property. They are demanding access to your property to install their own items. That is a completely different legal question. The case was assigned to Judge Harold Morrison in the Collin County Civil Court. Our first court date was scheduled for early June, about 4 months after the initial birdhouse incident. David told me that most cases like this get settled before ever reaching a courtroom, but the HOA seemed determined to push forward. I continued receiving letters from the HOA throughout this period. The fines kept accumulating, now totaling over $3,000. Sharon sent me a personal letter at one point, urging me to do the right thing for the community and drop my lawsuit. I did not respond. A few of my neighbors started talking to me more during this time. Word had spread about the lawsuit and opinions were divided. Some people thought I was being stubborn over something minor. Others were quietly supportive, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach. Jennifer Mills, the woman who had spoken up at the board meeting, stopped by one Saturday afternoon. "I just wanted to say I think you are doing the right thing," she said. I let them put that birdhouse on my tree because I did not want the hassle, but it bothered me that they never asked. Someone needs to push back on this stuff. Thank you, I said. Honestly, some days I wonder if I should have just put the birdhouse back and avoided all this drama. No, Jennifer said firmly. If we let them get away with small things, they will just keep pushing. My sister lives in a neighborhood in Austin where the HOA tried to fine people for parking their own cars in their own driveways overnight. It started with small stuff like this and just escalated. You are drawing a line. That matters. Her words helped. It was easy to feel isolated when you were fighting with the HOA, like everyone thought you were just being a troublemaker. Knowing that at least some people understood made the stress more bearable. The HOA did not make things easy. In late April, they sent out a neighborhood newsletter that included a section about community members who prioritize personal preferences over neighborhood harmony. It did not mention me by name, but the reference was obvious. They also included a lengthy article about the importance of the beautification initiative and how the birdhouses were bringing joy to residents and visitors alike. In May, Sharon tried a different approach. She showed up at my door again, this time with a more conciliatory tone. "Marcus, can we talk?" she asked. She was not wearing her usual power suit, just jeans and a simple blouse. She looked tired. "Sure," I said, curious about what angle she was going to try now. "This lawsuit is costing the HOA a lot of money," she said. "Money that could be going toward community improvements instead of legal fees. I know we got off on the wrong foot, and I take responsibility for that. I should have communicated better about the beautification project." I waited for the but. "But I really do not understand why you are being so stubborn about this. It is just a birdhouse. It does not hurt anything. It actually looks nice. Why not just put it back and we can all move on?" "Because you did not ask permission," I said. "Sharon, this is not about the birdhouse. If you had knocked on my door and said, 'Hey, we are doing this beautification project. Would you mind if we put a birdhouse on your oak tree?' I probably would have said yes. But you did not do that. You just installed it on my property without asking, and then when I took it down, you threatened to fine me. And now you are suing me. You are asking me to accept that you have the right to use my property however you want without my permission. I cannot accept that." "The bylaws," Sharon started. "The bylaws do not override property law," I interrupted. "My attorney has been very clear about that. You do not have the legal right to install things on my property no matter what the bylaws say." Sharon's conciliatory expression hardened. "Fine, then we will see what the judge says. But I want you to know that you are wasting thousands of dollars of HOA funds, money that comes from your neighbors, because you could not be a team player about a simple birdhouse. You are the one who chose to sue," I said. "You could drop the lawsuit at any time." She left without another word. I watched her drive away and felt a mix of frustration and sadness. This should never have become such a huge issue. If people could just respect basic boundaries and communicate like reasonable adults, none of this would have been necessary. The court date arrived on a warm Tuesday in early June. I took the day off work and met David at the Collin County Courthouse in McKinney. The building was an imposing structure with tall columns and marble floors. We went through security and found our assigned courtroom on the 3rd floor. Sharon was there with Patricia Ventura and 2 other board members. We did not make eye contact. The courtroom was mostly empty except for us and a few other people waiting for different cases. Judge Morrison was hearing several matters that day, and we were 4th on the docket. When our case was called, we all stood and approached the bench. Judge Morrison was a man in his late 50s with graying hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked over the case file and then peered at us over his glasses. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said. "The HOA installed a birdhouse on the defendant's tree without permission, and when he removed it, you sued him." "Your Honor, if I may explain," Patricia began. "I am summarizing," Judge Morrison said. "Is my summary accurate? In essence, yes, Your Honor. However, the context is important." The Ridgewood Estates HOA initiated a community beautification project that was properly approved by the board. As part of this initiative, decorative birdhouses were installed throughout the neighborhood to enhance aesthetic appeal and encourage local wildlife. Mr. Chen's tree was selected because of its prominent visibility from the community walking path. "Is the tree on Mr. Chen's property?" the judge asked. "It is within his property boundaries, yes, but—" "And did you ask his permission before installing the birdhouse?" Patricia hesitated. "The board approved the project, Your Honor. Under the HOA bylaws, the board has authority to implement community improvements." "That is not what I asked. Did anyone from the HOA ask Mr. Chen for permission to attach something to his tree before doing so?" "No, Your Honor." However, the bylaws section 7.3 grants the HOA authority over aesthetic standards throughout the community. Judge Morrison turned to David. "Counsel, your position." "Your Honor, this is a straightforward property rights issue. Mr. Chen owns his land, including all trees on that land. The HOA cannot unilaterally decide to use his property for their projects without his consent. We have provided a property survey confirming that the tree in question is entirely within Mr. Chen's boundaries, approximately 20 feet from the nearest property line. Texas property law is clear that the HOA's authority is limited to common areas and to reasonable restrictions on how owners use their own property. The HOA does not have the right to use an owner's property for HOA purposes without permission. "What about the bylaws the HOA keeps citing?" Judge Morrison asked. "HOA bylaws cannot override state property law, Your Honor. The bylaws can regulate certain aspects of how owners maintain their property, but they cannot grant the HOA ownership rights or usage rights to private property. If HOAs could do what Ridgewood Estates is claiming here, they could theoretically install anything they wanted on private property, like signs, decorations, or structures, without any input from the property owner. That is not how property law works in Texas." Judge Morrison looked back at Patricia. "Do you have any case law supporting the HOA's position that their bylaws allow them to install items on private property without the owner's consent?" Patricia flipped through her notes. "Your Honor, we would cite several cases where HOAs were upheld in enforcing aesthetic standards. In Reynolds v. Maple Creek HOA, the court found that the HOA could require homeowners to repaint houses that did not meet color standards. In Patterson v. Those cases are about requiring homeowners to maintain their own property according to certain standards," Judge Morrison interrupted. "I am asking if you have any case law where an HOA was permitted to use private property for HOA installations without the owner's permission." "The principle is the same, Your Honor. The HOA has authority over community aesthetics." "The principle is not the same at all," Judge Morrison said, his tone sharpening. "Requiring someone to paint their house a certain color is very different from installing your own items on their property." "Do you have relevant case law or not?" Patricia was silent for a moment. "We believe the bylaws are clear, Your Honor." "So that is a no." Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. "Here is the problem with your case, Miss Ventura. Your HOA has confused its regulatory authority with ownership rights. Yes, HOAs can regulate how homeowners use and maintain their property. That authority is well established, but regulation is not the same as usage. The HOA does not get to use private property for its own purposes without the owner's consent. Your Honor, with respect, this is a minor aesthetic item that weighs less than 5 pounds and causes no damage. It does not matter if it weighs 5 pounds or 5 ounces, Judge Morrison said. The size and scope of the intrusion does not change the fundamental principle. If I came onto your property, Miss Ventura, and installed a tasteful flower box on your fence without asking, would you be okay with that? That is different, Your Honor. I am not part of an HOA community. The principle is the same, Judge Morrison said, echoing her earlier words back to her. Property rights mean you get to decide what happens on your property. Mr. Chen's property includes his trees. The HOA needed to ask permission before installing anything on those trees. They did not ask. Therefore, Mr. Chen was within his rights to remove the birdhouse. This case is dismissed. I felt a surge of relief so powerful I almost laughed. David placed a hand on my shoulder, grinning. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, I am granting Mr. Chen's counterclaim for legal fees. The HOA will be responsible for reimbursing his attorney costs. As for the fines the HOA assessed, those are void. Mr. Chen owes nothing. Patricia tried one more time. Your Honor, we would ask the court to at least recognize the HOA's good faith effort to improve the community. Good faith would have involved asking permission first, Judge Morrison said. Your client overstepped its authority, and when the homeowner rightfully objected, instead of correcting course, the HOA doubled down and initiated a frivolous lawsuit. I am not going to reward that behavior. My ruling stands. He banged his gavel, and it was over. David shook my hand, and we walked out of the courtroom. Behind us, I could hear Patricia speaking to Sharon in low, urgent tones. Outside the courthouse, David and I stood in the warm June sunshine. Congratulations, he said. That was about as clear a victory as you can get. Thank you for everything, I said. I could not have done this without you. You did the right thing by fighting it, David said. Too many homeowners just cave to this kind of HOA pressure because they do not want the hassle. But when people stand up for their rights, it sets a precedent. Other homeowners in your neighborhood are going to benefit from this ruling. We discussed the next steps for collecting the legal fees, and then I drove home. I felt lighter than I had in months. The weight of the lawsuit, the constant stress of wondering whether I was doing the right thing, all of it lifted. The judge had confirmed what I had known all along. My property was my property, and the HOA could not just use it however they wanted. When I got home, I sent an email to Jennifer Mills, thanking her for her support and letting her know about the ruling. She responded within an hour, congratulating me and saying she was going to bring it up at the next HOA meeting. The official court order was filed the next day. David sent me a copy and I read through it with satisfaction. The judge's language was clear and unambiguous. The HOA had overstepped its authority, the lawsuit was frivolous, and I was entitled to full reimbursement of my legal costs, which totaled just over $4,500. I expected that would be the end of it, but I underestimated Sharon's stubbornness. A week after the court ruling, I received a new letter from the HOA. This one informed me that I was being fined $200 for having an unsightly metal structure in my backyard. Referring to the latter, I had left leaning against my garage after doing some gutter maintenance the previous weekend. I stared at the letter in disbelief. Were they seriously doing this? After just losing a lawsuit for overreach, they were now looking for any excuse to fine me. I took photos of the ladder, showing that it was neatly positioned against the garage wall and barely visible from any public area. I then walked around the neighborhood and took photos of at least 6 other houses that had ladders, garden tools, or other equipment visible in their yards. None of them had received fines. I forwarded everything to David. He called me that evening, sounding more annoyed than I had ever heard him. This is retaliation, he said. They are targeting you because you won the lawsuit. This is actually illegal. What do? I asked. We file another lawsuit, this time including harassment and retaliation claims. And honestly, Marcus, I think it is time to consider going after the individual board members, not just the HOA as an entity. This is personal vindictiveness and it is crossing some serious legal lines. I did not want to sue again. I was tired. I had won the Birdhouse case and just wanted to move on with my life. But David was right. If I let this go, Sharon and the board would just keep harassing me with frivolous fines until they either broke me financially or forced me to move. Okay, I said, let us do it. David drafted another lawsuit, this one much more aggressive than the first. We sued the HOA for harassment and retaliation, and we named Sharon, along with the other 4 board members, as individual defendants. We argued that they were abusing their positions to target a homeowner who had successfully defended his property rights. And we sought damages, as well as an injunction preventing the HOA from taking any enforcement actions against me without clear and documented violations. We also filed a complaint with the Texas Real Estate Commission, which has oversight over HOA management companies and can investigate abuse. David explained that this would create a record of the HOA's behavior that could be useful if other homeowners had similar issues in the future. The lawsuit got people's attention. Within days of it being filed, I started getting calls and emails from neighbors. Some were supportive, saying they had also experienced HOA harassment and were glad someone was finally pushing back. Others accused me of being a troublemaker who was costing the neighborhood money with frivolous lawsuits. One neighbor, a man named Tom Gardner who lived 2 streets over, stopped by to talk to me in person. He was in his 30s, a teacher at one of the local high schools, and he seemed genuinely interested in understanding the situation. "I heard about the Birdhouse thing and thought it was kind of silly," he admitted. "But then I heard about the retaliation with the ladder fine, and that changed my perspective. I have been getting annoyed with the HOA lately too. They sent me a notice last month saying my mailbox was the wrong shade of black. My mailbox. Who cares what shade of black it is?" "That is exactly the kind of thing I am talking about," I said. "The HOA has gone from maintaining reasonable community standards to micromanaging every tiny detail of people's properties, and when you push back, they retaliate." "What can we do about it?" Tom asked, honestly. "Show up to HOA meetings. Vote in the next board election. There are more homeowners than board members. If enough people get involved, we can change the leadership and the culture." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "When is the next meeting?" "3rd Thursday of every month." 7 o'clock at the community center. "I will be there," he said. Over the next few weeks, word spread about what was happening. More neighbors reached out, sharing their own HOA horror stories. A woman named Patricia Chen, no relation to me, had been fined for planting roses that were supposedly the wrong color. A retired couple, the Hendersons, had been threatened with legal action because their car was parked in their own driveway for more than 48 consecutive hours, violating some obscure rule in the bylaws. I created a simple email list for people who were interested in HOA reform. Within a month, I had 47 households signed up. We started coordinating to attend HOA meetings together and ask questions about how funds were being spent, what authority the board actually had, and whether their enforcement actions were being applied fairly across the neighborhood. Sharon hated it. The July HOA meeting had over 60 residents in attendance, the most that anyone could remember. When Sharon tried to rush through the agenda, people started asking for clarification and details. When she announced new fines against 3 homeowners, people demanded to see the specific bylaw violations and asked why other similar situations had not been fined. The meeting lasted over 3 hours and accomplished almost nothing because Sharon kept getting bogged down in questions she could not or would not answer clearly. The second lawsuit moved forward through the legal system. The HOA tried to get it dismissed, arguing that the ladder fine was a legitimate enforcement action. David demolished that argument by presenting the photos I had taken of other properties with visible equipment that had not been fined. He also subpoenaed HOA records showing that in the past 5 years, only 3 homeowners had ever been fined for visible equipment in their yards, and all 3 had been fined only after filing complaints against the HOA or board members for other issues. The pattern of retaliation was undeniable. The judge ordered the HOA to attend mediation before the case could proceed to trial. The mediation was scheduled for late August. It was held at a neutral office space in Plano, with a professional mediator named Susan Ortiz facilitating. David and I sat on one side of a conference table. Sharon, Patricia Ventura, and two board members sat on the other side. Susan started by explaining the mediation process and asking each side to briefly state their position. David spoke first, laying out the timeline of events. The initial birdhouse installation, my removal of it, the HOA's escalating response, the first lawsuit and our victory, and then the immediate retaliation through the ladder fine and the pattern of targeting that we had documented. When Sharon spoke, her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Mr. Chen has been nothing but a disruptive influence in this neighborhood. He refuses to comply with reasonable community standards. He has filed multiple frivolous lawsuits that have cost the HOA tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, and he has been actively organizing other homeowners to undermine the board's authority. This is not about a birdhouse or a ladder. This is about someone who wants to live in an HOA community but refuses to follow the rules. Which rules specifically has Mr. Chen violated? Susan asked. He removed community property without authorization, Sharon said. The court already ruled that the birdhouse was installed on Mr. Chen's property without his permission and that he had every right to remove it, David said. What other rules has he violated? Sharon pulled out a folder. He has been late mowing his lawn on multiple occasions. He parks his car in his driveway rather than his garage. He has hosted gatherings with more than 6 cars parked on the street. He has failed to promptly remove his garbage cans from the curb after collection day. Have you issued formal notices for any of those violations? Susan asked. Not yet, but we have documented them. So he has not actually violated any rules that you have formally enforced, Susan said. You have just been watching him and documenting minor issues that you have not documented for other homeowners. We document issues for all homeowners, Sharon said. Then I would like to see those records, David said. Because in the discovery process for this lawsuit, the HOA has only provided documentation for 3 homeowners, all of whom had previously been in disputes with the board. If you are documenting issues for all homeowners, those records should be easy to produce. Sharon looked at Patricia, who flipped through her own notes. Those records are not relevant to this lawsuit, Patricia said. They are absolutely relevant, David said. They go directly to the question of whether the HOA is targeting Mr. Chen specifically or enforcing rules fairly across the neighborhood. The mediation continued for 4 hours. Susan met with each side separately, trying to find common ground. During one of our private sessions, she told David and me that the HOA's position was weak and they knew it. They are embarrassed, Susan said. The birdhouse lawsuit made them look foolish, and now this retaliation evidence is making it worse. They want this to go away, but Sharon is having trouble accepting that she overstepped. What are they offering? David asked. They will void the ladder fine, agree not to take any enforcement actions against Mr. Chen for 6 months, and pay half of your legal fees for this second lawsuit. Not good enough, David said. They need to agree to a consent decree that requires them to apply all rules fairly and to document enforcement actions consistently for all homeowners. They need to pay full legal fees for both lawsuits, and frankly, I think Sharon needs to resign from the board. She has shown a pattern of abuse of power that is not going to stop just because we settle this case. Susan went back to the other side. She returned an hour later looking tired. Sharon will not resign and the board will not force her out. But they will agree to the consent decree. Full legal fees for the second lawsuit plus the outstanding fees from the first lawsuit that they have not yet paid. And a 2-year probationary period where any enforcement actions against Mr. Chen have to be approved by an independent third party to verify they are legitimate and not retaliatory. David looked at me. What do you think? I thought about it. I would have preferred Sharon to resign, but getting an independent reviewer for any enforcement actions against me was actually better in some ways. It meant I would have protection against retaliation going forward. I can live with that, I said. We went back into joint session and finalized the settlement. Sharon signed the documents with a pen that looked like it might break from the force she was applying. She would not look at me. The settlement was entered into court records the following week. The HOA paid David's firm nearly $12,000 in total legal fees. The consent decree was detailed and specific, requiring the HOA to maintain written records of all rule violations observed, document all enforcement actions taken, and provide quarterly reports showing enforcement patterns across the neighborhood. Any enforcement action against me for the next 2 years had to be reviewed by an independent HOA management consultant before being issued. I thought that would finally be the end of it. I had won both legal battles, gotten my legal fees paid, and secured protections against future retaliation. I could go back to my normal life, but Sharon had one more card to play. In early September, I received a notice that there would be a special HOA meeting to vote on a special assessment. The board was proposing a one-time fee of $1,500 per household to cover unexpected legal expenses and community improvements. The timing was not subtle. They had just paid out $12,000 in legal fees, and now they wanted to recoup that money from all the homeowners. I sent an email to my reform group email list immediately. This is Sharon trying to make everyone hate me by spreading the cost of her mistakes across the whole neighborhood. We need to show up and vote this down. The turnout for the special meeting was incredible. Over 100 homeowners packed into the community center. People were standing along the walls because there were not enough chairs. Sharon stood at the front with the other board members, looking nervous for the first time since I had met her. She tried to present the special assessment as being primarily for necessary community improvements, with only a portion going toward legal fees. But Tom Gardner stood up with a printed spreadsheet. I submitted a records request under the HOA bylaws and got copies of the financial statements, he said. The HOA has over $80,000 in reserves. The legal fees from Marcus's lawsuits totaled $12,000. That is 15% of reserves. It is a hit, sure, but it is not an emergency that requires a special assessment. Can you explain why we need this assessment when we have adequate reserves? Sharon stumbled through an answer about wanting to maintain a healthy reserve fund for future needs, but the damage was done. Other homeowners started asking questions about how the money would be spent, why the board had allowed legal fees to escalate so high, and whether there would be changes to prevent similar situations in the future. Jennifer Mills stood up. I think we all know what this special assessment is really about. The board made bad decisions, pushed a frivolous lawsuit instead of admitting they were wrong, and now they want all of us to pay for it. I vote no, and I encourage everyone else to vote no as well. The room erupted in applause. Sharon tried to restore order, but people kept standing up to speak against the assessment. Person after person criticized the board's handling of the Birdhouse situation, shared their own negative experiences with HOA overreach, and questioned why Sharon was still in charge after causing such an expensive mess. When the vote finally happened, the special assessment was defeated by a margin of 92-11. Sharon looked like she had been slapped. She adjourned the meeting without comment and left quickly. Over the next few weeks, something shifted in the neighborhood. People who had been afraid to criticize the HOA started speaking up. The reform email list grew to over 70 households. We organized a slate of candidates for the upcoming November board election, including Tom Gardner, Jennifer Mills, and a retired attorney named Chen, who was also no relation to me but who everyone started calling the other Chen. Sharon saw the writing on the wall. In early October, she announced that she would not be seeking re-election to the board. She framed it as a personal decision to pursue other interests, but everyone knew she was stepping down because she was going to lose. The November election was not even close. Tom, Jennifer, and Harold all won their races by huge margins. 2 other reform candidates won the remaining open seats. By December, the board had completely turned over, and the new leadership immediately began implementing changes. They revised the enforcement policies to require documentation and consistency. They established an appeals process for homeowners who disagreed with fines or violations. They created a community input system so residents could weigh in on major decisions before the board voted. And they formally apologized to me at a public meeting for the way the previous board had handled the birdhouse situation. I never did reinstall that birdhouse. It stayed in my garage, a bright blue reminder of the absurdity that had consumed 6 months of my life. Sometimes I would see it when I was getting tools or working on projects, and I would smile at how something so small had led to something so significant. The oak tree continued to thrive in my backyard, providing shade during hot Texas summers. Birds nested in its branches without needing a manufactured birdhouse, just as they always had. And most importantly, the tree remained exactly as I wanted it, on my property, under my control. The HOA drama had been exhausting and stressful, but it had also brought about real change in Ridgewood Estates. The new board was collaborative rather than authoritarian. Enforcement was fair and transparent. Homeowners felt like they had a voice in their community rather than being subjects ruled over by a petty tyrant. Sharon moved out of the neighborhood the following spring. I heard she had taken a position on the board of a different HOA in Frisco. I felt sorry for those homeowners, but figured they would eventually learn the same lesson we had. Property rights matter, and no HOA bylaw can override your fundamental right to control your own land. As for me, I went back to my quiet life. I worked from home, maintained my property to reasonable standards, and occasionally attended HOA meetings when important issues came up. The birdhouse incident had taught me that sometimes you have to fight for principles even when it seems easier to give in. Property rights are not just abstract legal concepts. They are practical protections that prevent organizations and individuals from overstepping their bounds. I never expected that removing an unauthorized birdhouse from my tree would lead to lawsuits, community organizing, and a complete overhaul of HOA leadership. But looking back, I would do it all again. Not because I enjoyed the conflict or the stress, but because standing up for what was right had made my neighborhood a better place to live. The judge's ruling had been clear and unambiguous. Trees on my property are my property, and no one can use them without my permission. It was a simple principle, but one that needed to be defended. In the end, defending that principle had protected not just my rights, but the rights of every homeowner in Ridgewood Estates. On warm evenings, I would still sit on my back patio with a cup of coffee, looking up at the oak tree. Its branches swayed in the breeze, dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. No bright blue birdhouse interrupted the natural beauty. Just a tree growing peacefully on my land exactly as it should be, and that, I realized, was worth fighting for.